going live. All right, we are live. Hey everybody, welcome to this very special 50th edition of our Boston Basic Income discussion group.
I can't believe it's been 50 of them.
It's been 50, yeah.
That's a good year. Yeah.
So we're taking this opportunity to kind of get back to the basics and talk about basic income. The twist
is it actually playing?
Yeah, I have it paused there because I don't want to use up too much bandwidth. So yeah, my name is Alex Hallett. I host these things for people who are interested in knowing that. But yeah, the twist today is that we're imagining a world without basic income. Now that might sound weird because that's the world we live in. But a lot of times in these discussions, I'll say something like, I don't think minimum wage makes sense or something like that. And then someone might say, well, okay, sure, but that only applies in a world with basic income. So we're going to talk about a world without basic income and what kinds of things we would expect from the economy, we would expect from our society to kind of compensate for what basic income is not offering us. So we can imagine starting in a world with basic income, and then what happens if the politics change and then we remove it, or we can even just imagine in our world, what things are the way they are, kind of because we don't have a basic income. So the answers could be similar. It could be that we imagine a world with a basic income, and then it ends, and then we can imagine, well, what kinds of things would have to happen, and then those things maybe look a little bit like what our world looks like. So yeah, I want to start by going around the room, and I guess the question is, what parts of our society and our economy do you think are in place or exist because we don't have a basic income? So I guess that's kind of the starting question. Yeah.
Well, clearly things like the Fed mandate to reduce unemployment to zero, and a lot of the explicit policy initiatives around making sure that everyone's employed to get their income that way, probably is largely because we don't have a basic income. And then probably a lot of labor protections, like regulations, minimum wage. Not all of them, like some of them I think would persist with a basic income, especially those that solve information problems, where like it's hard for consumers or workers to get the right information otherwise. But those that have to do with like poor bargaining power on the part of workers because they can't say no, like minimum wage and other regulations of those kinds.
Yeah.
And tariffs, to a large extent, probably a bunch of things I'm not thinking of.
Tariffs.
Probably a bunch of other things that I'm not thinking of.
Yeah.
So, I feel like smoking garden. I'm just gonna offer a couple of sort of thoughts that, one, we may sort of already have a basic income, we just don't call it that. And I might offer that if we had a basic income and wiped out all those other things that are sort of politically palatable proxies for basic income, you might be surprised that basic income might not, it'll cost more, I'm sure, but not so much more that it would be like eye-popping, and that it would not put us in a position to be thinking, it may never happen, but then, I keep talking about the fourth, industrial revolution. In a fourth industrial revolution, you got to figure out some other way of one person, is the 500,000 billionaire, and everybody else has nothing.
Right.
You just can't have this kind of, that's real income inequality. So I think there is an element of, we're doing some things already in society that would be very interesting to sort of be able to think in terms of if a basic income, even today, because I'm not so much a today guy on this issue, but I would say that in this respect, even today, we could look at it and say, wow, if we eliminated all these other things, and so you mentioned like labor bargaining and all that sort of thing. And there might be some real benefits to stuff like that because, in a lot of respects, probably something's gotten really out of whack with respect to, there's just not really equal parties at the bargaining table. And that creates lots of other distortions. So not that I know specifics, but there are probably some supermarket chains where employees have considerably different compensation than others. So recently Stop and Shop was on strike, and you might wonder, is there a sort of package better than some others, and why not? And that might also be leveled out in a way that would be positive, right? Because income inequality can also be at different stratas, right? So
Okay.
that's what comes to mind on where we're at today. And, but I would say that at least notionally we ought to be trying to conceive of a world with a basic income, because that would actually be a pretty cool world to get to, right? Like, I don't know that we'll ever get there, but if we at least started thinking about it and we see these amazing technologies and things happening, why shouldn't we be sort of thinking that would be kind of a pretty cool world if we could get there?
So maybe to kind of sum it up, some of the existing social programs that we have now maybe exist to kind of fill the void that, or serve the purpose that basic income would serve.
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. Mom.
I was going to say something similar. A world without basic income means we need a world where somebody makes decisions about who gets money and how. And if we don't have that kind of funneling going on, either politically or for employers, that creates a basis for more freedom for everyone, not just in getting an income, but also in being able to make decisions about where you live, what you do in life, all the things we're talking about in here.
Yeah.
Right now, so many decisions get made, for example, about health care. You have to stay in that job, or you don't have health care. Who wants to live without health care? So many people make decisions to remain in a job they hate, or they're not even contributing much to society through that job. But they have to be taken care of in a certain way through wages and through health care. So that's what's happening. That's what would happen in a world without basic income.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Steve.
Let's see, this plain old welfare system and payday loans and some mortgages, and some people think that crime is basically an economic problem of poor people. A reasonable response among poor people to solve their economic problems. But I do want to ask if Social Security is technically an insurance program. You pay in and then you get out. But actually, nowadays, people are getting a lot more out than they put in. So it's no longer, or it soon is not going to be a self-supporting program.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Richard?
Oh, way back in the early 1600s with Sir Thomas More saying that if we provided people with money, they wouldn't have to steal. In his book Utopia,
Right.
This was foreseen. So we wouldn't have the prison industrial complex, like Stephen said, and let's see. That's what I was going to say about the prison industrial complex, but he already covered that.
Cool.
I don't know what else to say.
That's okay. Nick?
I think where my imagination goes is, are we? I find it a little hard to keep track of what the hypothetical is here, but I think in the real world now, it's really difficult to live a life where you have options and freedom without making your career really, really central. Or at least that's the way a lot of people deal with the situation. And so I think that is something that would, it's interesting, I think, to try to imagine how that would be different. I think a lot of people would have the option to, I think this is what kind of what Joan was talking about, to prioritize different things. You know, I mean, some people I'm sure would still be very passionate about entering a certain line of work, but I think you'd have a lot of right now there are a lot of people who are doing it because it's sort of like it's a compromise. It's like as long as I have to organize my life around some kind of career because I need to just to live, you know, then I might as well be this one.
Yeah.
I think it would be great if that was loosened up.
Yeah.
I have something.
Yeah, go ahead,
well, caregivers are not compensated for like who take care of their children or some family member, like their mothers or their sick aunt or whatever, and so mothers, they don't earn enough money to get if their careers are compromised because they have to do these things to take care of their children or whatever, so they don't get as far in their career. But if they have a basic income, they can sort of compensate for that.
Yeah. So to kind of sum up what everyone said, the problem that basic income solves is that it gets spending money to consumers. So in a world without basic income, we need to do some combination of figuring out another way to get spending money to consumers, or many other ways to get spending money to consumers, and then also figuring out how to, if those mechanisms are not perfect, figuring out how to respond to a situation in which not everyone has very much spending money. So, you know, like we'd have to respond to poverty, we'd have to respond to crime and that kind of stuff like Steve and Richard were talking about. And then in terms of what Martin was talking about, he brought up, you know, all these existing welfare programs and stuff. You know, if you don't have a basic income, then the question is, what do you have? So Bethany brought up job creation. You know, like instead of having an efficient labor market where the only purpose of wages is to incentivize the labor that needs doing, in a world without a basic income, you'd have to, you know, consumers still need spending money. So, you know, maybe one of the ways you can get them spending money is by distorting the labor market, creating more jobs than necessary, you know, making them pay higher wages than necessary. Like we started, you know, at the beginning talking about minimum wage, you know, that kind of thing. And then, you know, maybe a hodgepodge of other kind of income support programs that, you know, are not basic income, but are kind of serving that role of getting consumer spending money. And then, you know, maybe in the world without basic income, we don't have, you know, maybe there's still, you know, more consumer spending that the economy could handle, but we're just not producing stuff because people don't have as much money as they could have. So there's kind of like, I don't know, all kinds of aspects to this. And I was thinking about, you know, you guys brought up Social Security, and I was thinking about Social Security because that's kind of like a basic income for the elderly. So what if we imagined a world in which Social Security was gone? You know, old age Social Security was gone. And then what would we have to do to compensate? And we can imagine like all kinds of problems, like needing to take care of old people who are struggling and, you know, a lot of old people in poverty and, you know, that kind of stuff. So, you know, we can kind of, I think, extrapolate that because we kind of have a basic income in part of our economy. We can extrapolate that to the whole economy and then ask ourselves, well, how much of this stuff that isn't going well is a result of us not having, you know, this basic infrastructure that you know we depend on for old people, but not for everyone else. Yeah.
It's sort of like Medicare for all.
Yeah.
It's Social Security for all. There was a candidate in Maryland that was running on that last year.
Social Security for all?
So just like lowering the age so everyone gets it. Yeah, that would basically be a basic income. Depending on
get different amounts of social security.
right. Yeah, I mean, like Steve was saying, it's an insurance program, and you kind of get out what you put in. So it's not exactly the same. If you just look at the period of time during which the person is retired or receiving the Social Security, then it looks like a basic income during that time period. But if you look at their whole life, they were putting in money earlier and getting.
I was thinking like
money
it
out
doesn't
later.
solve the problem of somebody who never had money to begin with.
Right.
Was
Or
there
not a
a
job.
Right.
or didn't have a job before.
Right. So Social Security is going to disproportionately benefit the people who earned more money in their lives. So those are probably the people who need it the least. But it was designed as not as a way to kind of support everyone, but as a way to prevent people who weren't poor from becoming poor when they retired.
But before
Yeah.
Social Security was implemented, the people who were already elderly or are getting elevated benefits that even though they didn't put anything in. So
Yeah, that makes sense because you had to have a way to transition into it. Yeah. Okay. So, I don't know. We didn't have an article to read, so we actually gotta
I know
talk about
somebody
stuff.
up there, Mitchell said it's different without an article.
Different without having an article. Yeah. So yeah. I mean, so without basic income, I mean, so I guess I'll speak to Martin because Martin tends to think more in the future, as basic income kind of is a solution to the fourth industrial revolution, something that hasn't quite hit us yet. But when we look at today, when we look at this hodgepodge of welfare programs, do we feel like that's optimal? Do we feel like it makes sense to have a safety net that catches people when they fall through the cracks of the economy, instead of just having an economy that works?
but a net has holes in it. We want to have a floor that doesn't have any holes in it with like a basic income.
Right, and the idea is that that if you're even putting a net there, then the economy itself has holes in it. And if you have something like a basic income, then you have this fundamental economic infrastructure that allows people to get the benefit from the economy.
And there's
Yeah.
a simplicity to that that's appealing because all the other social programs, people have to make decisions about who's getting what and why. And
Right.
as we all know, if you've been involved in any of that bureaucracy, it's really hard to get through it and get through all the forms, the phone calls. I mean, some people just give up. The people who need it most sometimes give up because they can't navigate
Hello.
that system.
And there's also people who are biased within the system, like who are making the decisions. Like,
Yeah.
Well, like the marriage count, the person who was supposed to issue marriage certificates in Kentucky, who was actually voted out in November. They were
Making their own decisions
Mhm.
based on their own prejudices. That's what happens. I mean, that's when it's a political operation, that's bound to happen. But basic income is just sort of that simple. It goes to everybody, no questions asked, and there's no political agenda behind it once it's in place. Now there is, because it's not
Yeah.
in place. Now we have to fight for it somehow, or Adrienne does, right?
Yeah. So hey, I'm Alex. This is the group.
Nice to meet you.
Sorry I'm late.
No
That's all right.
Emails and everything.
Yeah.
I go to Emerson College.
Oh, great.
Oh.
Covering this for my photojournalism class. It's not going to a paper or
great.
anything, but
Cool.
All
I
right.
spoke on Facebook.
Yes. Right. And what was your name again?
Liam.
Liam. Good to see you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah. So we've all been here before,
Okay.
and you haven't.
I have not.
Are you interested in jumping right in? Like, I'd like to hear your thoughts about basic income, how you
Yeah,
got into
absolutely.
basic income. Yeah.
My introduction to it came from Andrew Yang. which
Okay.
you all know who Andrew Yang is. He spoke in Boston Common, I think it was about a week ago, and I picked up his book, which I finished yesterday, and I still have some questions about UDI that they're going
Yeah. By the way, we are streaming live on YouTube. So as long as you're okay with your voice being online, that's fine. If you want to actually be in the video, you can sit over on this side, but if you sit over there, then you will not be visible.
Does anyone not want to be photographed? Again, it's not going to be in a paper published.
Okay.
Photographed.
It's for a class.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Fine.
I think most of us over here are already kind of on the live stream, so
Yeah.
we're yeah, we're appearing
Yeah,
everywhere.
well,
I don't know, Steve and Richard, are you guys okay with Liam photographing? Okay. Yeah, so I mean, you came on a good night because we're talking about basic income in general. Usually we have a more kind of specific topic, but we're getting into kind of, we're asking this hypothetical question of, in a world without basic income, what kinds of things are true about our world that are that way kind of because we don't have this kind of economic infrastructure. We don't have just automatic income that everybody gets. So feel free to, I mean, you said you had some questions. Feel free to ask them. Yeah.
Sure. I'll think this.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts about what you think might be true in our world that that kind of are that way because people don't have this kind of basic income? Like, so one example that we were just talking about is Social Security is kind of basic income for old people.
Mm-hmm.
What would happen if we removed Social Security? What kinds of things would then be true in our society? What kinds of things would we have to do? So we can kind of start with that and imagine that instead of it just being old people, it's everyone, and then what happens when you remove it?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm really curious about how it works in conjunction with Social Security in general and
Yeah.
and welfare, whether it replaces welfare.
Yeah. So basic income, as it's defined broadly, it does not replace anything. It's just an income that goes to everyone, evenly distributed, unconditional, universal. We might discover that once we have a basic income in place and the basic income is high enough to support the full functioning of the economy, activate all the production, everything like that, we might find that some of these other programs, we look at them and are like, well, wait a minute, why is this here? And I think that's a little bit of what we're getting at today, which is, all of the things we have to do to compensate for the fact that people don't have money. So that can be existing welfare programs and stuff like that.
Well, transitioning to basic income, it would be hard to take money away from people who are already getting
Yeah.
money.
So I think
Probably isn't going to be that right away.
I think generally speaking, the smoothest way to do it is just to implement the basic income and gradually increase it until we kind of reach the level that the maximum level the economy can sustain, and then take a look at where we are and see if maybe some of this other stuff doesn't make sense or can be phased out, that kind of thing.
I don't want to get too
Yeah.
into the details, but how would that work with like welfare programs that have some kind of cutoff already, like income cutoff, right?
Yeah, so that's a question. Would the basic income count toward your income, you mean?
Right.
And
And if not, doesn't that get kind of strange at a certain point?
so that could be part of how you phase out other programs, is if you gradually increase people's incomes through the basic income, and then it ends up being that they don't qualify for the programs as much anymore. That could be just kind of like a natural way of phasing it out.
Well,
Yeah,
under
Richard.
Andrew Yang's plan, that you either have the $1,000 basic income or you have the current benefits. Well, if you have Social Security that's more than $1,000 a month, then you don't want a basic income. You want the
Right.
Social Security. If you
So
have
people choose.
Yeah, he makes people have to choose
Oh, I guess.
between existing benefits and the freedom dividend, which is what he calls his version of basic income. I think that's probably a mistake. I think that's probably a flaw in the plan. There's no reason why you would have to do it that way. In terms of, yeah,
Well, just because probably people wouldn't want to have money taken away, as I said. So if they have more money through Social
Right.
Security, why would they give that up for less money?
right. And there's the issue of if you give everyone $1,000 a month and then the the people who are on, support programs, they're the ones who maybe benefit the least because they get the least additional incremental income, or nothing if their benefit was already higher than what the basic
But
income
if
was.
you don't do that, doesn't it create some weird incentives in the economy? Like whatever qualifies you for welfare is still a strange incentive because now those people are getting extra. Not that that's necessarily bad, but I don't know how that affects like people's behavior.
I mean, it doesn't fix like the welfare traps and stuff that in all of the inefficiencies that are that kind of exist in the existing welfare system. But that doesn't mean we can't implement the UBI and then look at this other stuff and see what it doesn't have to be part of the same thing.
It doesn't have to be, although practically I would think it would work better that way because otherwise later it's going to be harder to like
Get people
it's harder to get people to give something up if it's not in like the moment when you're introducing something good. Otherwise it just feels like a loss.
I mean, I'm less interested in how hard it is to wean people off benefit programs than I am in how hard it is to implement the UBI in the first place.
Well, I understand that. But just as long as we're talking about this, it seems like you lose some of the maybe not the key benefits, but you lose some of the benefits of a UBI that we often talk about, like not having perverse incentives in the economy and stuff. If you also keep a bunch of other programs.
Well, the UBI itself won't create any perverse incentives.
No, it won't, but it also won't get rid of them, I guess.
But I think, I mean, it might really reduce the bite of some of them.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
that's true.
A bite, did you say?
Well, yeah, it sort of dilutes them or something, right? I mean, if right now the incentive not to take a job is that you'll lose these benefits,
right,
and then losing those benefits is really bad.
Right.
It's a lot less bad if you're getting a UBI.
Right.
That's true. That's
Yeah.
true. It is a lot less bad, although it still could be substantial, and but
Yeah,
I'd
I
rather
mean,
see the UBI just be higher, I guess, than have like half your benefits come from something that you lose if you get a job or something like that. But maybe it depends on how high the UBI is for me though too.
I mean, I think this effect that Nick is talking about in terms of the lessening of the perverse incentives, that effect is magnified the more the UBI is, and then the smaller the percentage of your income from these other support programs gets.
Yeah.
So it's not clear to me that just implementing the UBI first and getting it to the highest level possible, it's not clear that once you're in that place, that it's actually going to be harder to take away people's other benefits.
And I guess you want to know like how big it is, because if the UBI can only be sustained at a pretty low level, you're probably going to feel like you still want other programs like supplementing that for people who are the poorest. Yeah, and I mean the question is what problem are you trying to solve? So there's some social programs that we would still want even in the presence of a UBI, and there's plenty of things government should be spending money on. Even in the presence of UBI. I was only thinking of like basically almost cash transfer type things that just have like more conditions on them.
Yeah, but I'm thinking, I guess, specifically healthcare.
Oh yeah, I wasn't thinking about healthcare.
Yeah, so I mean,
because it's just too expensive to be easily covered by an income, and not only is it too expensive, it's got a fixed quality to it. In terms of the incentives to keep prices low and stuff like that, it makes sense as kind of an insurance program. Exactly. So you'd want that to be handled kind of and managed centrally in order to make it as efficient as possible. Yeah. And economists have talked about this too, how like because there's like a small chance of a huge cost, people's individual like saving behavior can't really account for it very well, and it works a lot better as like a centrally managed insurance program.
Yeah. Also, under the current system of healthcare, just a few months ago, there was a law that came into effect. The hospitals have to post how much their surgeries and things like that cost. But if you have an emergency and you're far away from the cheapest hospital, you don't really have a choice in which hospital you're going to go to.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, it is an interesting question, right? Like we can imagine taking away Social Security, for example, and all the things that we would have to do now to support old people who are maybe poor and struggling and that kind of thing. What other programs would come in to replace it? I'm looking at you because you're old. Yeah.
I wanted to talk about Andrew Yang's idea about automation is really tied in pretty tightly with UBI.
Yeah.
We don't really tie it in like that, but I mean, to think about earlier, we were talking about getting jobs, making jobs or careers the center of your life,
Yeah.
because that's the only way you get an income anyway.
Yeah.
If you are now in the position of automated out of your job and you have a UBI, I mean, how many people are like Elon Musk or people who have a real passion to work on something, or artists or writers?
Yeah.
I guess we'll find out, but I think there will be a lot of people who will be missing somebody telling them what to do. We talked about this before. I
Yeah,
know.
right.
But I still think it's real. And
So yeah, I mean, the question is, how do you help people have meaning and purpose in their lives, right?
Yeah, with a structure that's imposed from outside.
Right. And there's, I mean, so there's,
not an easy fix.
yeah, I mean, you also brought up, like how many Elon Musks are out there, and a question I like to ask is, how many Albert Einsteins are pumping gas,
Right,
how many,
right, yes, right.
how many Leonardo da Vinci's are, janitors or something like that,
Yes.
right? So we don't know how many of them there are, but certainly if you give them the freedom to spend their time how they choose, then you kind of unlock that potential.
Right.
I think that
Yeah.
the way that you can give people structure in their lives is to change our educational system from, well, they're like having people how do I say, they're not tailoring that. They're making it so people are receive their structure through all the way in there from kindergarten.
Yeah.
We have to. You start with you can't go to have recess whenever you want to. You have to sit
Teacher's the boss. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, it's an interesting question, and I think a lot of the jobs that we have today provide structure, but they're also not necessarily the thing that's going to provide people the most meaning and purpose, right? So if you ask the question, if everybody has enough money and they're free to do what they want, what's the best way to provide them structure? What's the best way to provide them purpose in their lives? The answer is probably not going to be to make up useless work that looks like the jobs we have today and then force them to do that work. I think there are better answers to that question, at least for most people. Right.
And education is a big part of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Education now actually is geared toward jobs.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
it wasn't when I was in college, but it is now.
Right.
And so when that goes away, that purpose and the curriculum tool toward that purpose will change.
Yeah.
You might be actually learning,
Right.
for the sake of learning.
In a world without basic income, if we're relying on the labor market for people to get their incomes, we have to create jobs.
Right.
We have to keep incomes high, and we have to train people,
Right.
use our education system to
Yeah.
train people into this world,
Right.
into this economy, instead of something else. Yeah, so you'd lose kind of this more intellectual side of education,
Right.
the
You
more
should need to teach
exploration.
people how to think, not what to think.
Right.
I said that before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess you could imagine the education system as, in general, filling this role of preparing people to have purpose and meaning
Well,
that
that's what it used to be.
Right.
It did. That was the whole idea
Especially
of
in college,
education.
but maybe
I mean,
not.
my age group,
Yeah.
anyway, was about broadening your horizons.
Right.
Understanding the world. And you didn't necessarily have a job when you graduated.
Right.
You might go abroad, learn
Right.
more, and travel. And
Yeah.
it was about your mind.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, and it changed over my lifetime to this kind of narrowing down to choose the field carefully, because you're going to be stuck in that field for the rest of your life. It's frowned upon to be a dilettante, go around,
Yeah.
learn this and learn that.
And
Liberal arts is on the way out for that reason. Liberal arts is
Yeah.
not useful anymore.
So I've read a little history that, and since I can't put my finger on it exactly, but some of what you're describing, it was attributed to the Reagan timeframe,
Yes, it
Reagan
was.
administration,
Yes, but,
suggesting that there was, some thought to make that a very deliberate transition. The tenor of the discussion, it just happened last night to be reading a paper called The Two Cultures, and it was published in 1959, that the quick and dirty is the individual is writing about the differences between education in the British Empire and education in Russia and the United States. And I only mention it just to say that discussions like what we're talking about here were alive and well, at least in 1959 when C.P. Snow wrote this lecture.
And in addition to intellectual exploration, you could theoretically prepare, have people have experiences already like they do starting clubs, getting into hobbies. Like there's a lot of things, like we don't think of education as much as a way to just like train self-directed meaning and purpose.
Right.
That's not what people need right now.
In Japan, they actually have in your high school, something like that. You're forced to choose a club or something to join after school to interact with people. But people who don't do that are called, they're in the go home club or something like that.
There's always a loophole. Well,
So-
I was just thinking, like, actually, even though, like, to get in here, for example, like, you have to be pretty straight and narrow in terms of academics, like, you also actually have to prepare to be a kind of self-directed person, and maybe that's partly why this has never seemed like a thing that I had trouble imagining how to do. It's like, I started a bunch of things and did theater on my own.
You're
like,
self-motivated.
yeah,
anyway.
exactly. But like, you could imagine more people doing that kind of thing if they had the time, or like, were
Yeah.
encouraged or cultivated.
There wasn't pressure to earn money right away. Yeah, choices get
Yeah.
made for that reason. I mean, they just do.
And
High school, we didn't have any clubs or anything like that. We was rather poor rural area. We have anything.
Yeah.
yeah, and I want to get back to just the topic of education. I was mentioning before that in a world without basic income, you'd have all this education geared toward training people for jobs. But it's also, sometimes it's not even job training. Sometimes it's just for the credential.
Oh, yeah.
Like you have the
Oh, yeah.
degree, and you're getting the credential in order to get the job. But what you're learning
Yeah.
might not have anything to do with
Well,
the,
this
yeah,
is
that's
part
the
of
job
what
that
allows
you're
it to
credentialing
do as good of a job as it does, preparing you to just be a self-directed, interested person.
Right.
Because in a lot of ways, like, my education had nothing to do with any specific job except being in academia, which I guess is what I'm doing.
Right.
But like, it also, because you could just have the credential and go on, like, you actually are able to learn like just sort of a lot of random interesting things still in some
Yeah.
schools.
Yeah, and ironically, the job-oriented curriculums like shop, vocational schools, all of that have disappeared. They really were
job-oriented
education, and now that's not here.
well, there's
There's actually
right. I was just gonna say that. Yeah.
there's actually a push to go back to that.
Is it?
Mhm.
Yeah, it's actually one of the things that Andrew Yang is advocating.
Oh, good.
Good.
Yeah.
Advocating for more vocational schools.
Contrast between automation and then advocating job training.
Right. Yeah.
What jobs does he want to train people for?
Uh,
Maybe the ones he thinks aren't going to be automated?
the kinds I think what he talks about is like the kinds where you like use your hands and yeah, that kind of
Those are hard
stuff.
to automate, maybe.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, the question is, I always think about this from the perspective of the consumers rather than the perspective of the workers. So if you're in a situation where businesses are not able to provide things for consumers because they don't have the workers, and for some reason their incentives are such that they're not training the workers themselves, then you might want to have the government intervene and incentivize people to train to work in these industries. But it's not for the workers. It's ultimately for the consumers, right? Because the economy exists, I always say this, but the economy exists for the benefit of the people. The most important role that a person has in the economy is to benefit from what the economy is providing for them. That's the whole reason the economy exists.
Yeah, so I agree with that. And I was just you were reminding me that as you at least talk about a world with basic income, it's not necessarily a world with no jobs or no things that people are doing. And so that would be like an interesting balance, because there are probably still things that once you get to the point of being an adult or being ready to apply to that job, like it's too late for that company to like
Right.
give you all of the training.
Right.
And so, in some sense, everything we do is like that, in the sense that if we think about like a small scale society, like their cognition is not appropriate for like, or a society without a written language, like it's too late by the time they show up at 21 to apply
Right.
for an American job. I mean, not really maybe, but it's
Right.
like not ideal. And so, there will be some need to educate people
Yeah. There's
for those for the possibility of having a job, and also just like to participate in politics and obviously all those other kinds of things.
Yeah, there's always going to be jobs, and there's always going to be people paying each other to do things that they wouldn't ordinarily do with their time. And again, I agree with everything you just said. And what's important is, in terms of the work that we need doing. Do we need to train? Do we need to put in? Does the government need to put in anything extra to help train people for the work that needs doing for the benefit of everyone,
Right.
not for the workers?
Yeah, I agree. And I guess this isn't really your point, but it seems like it's hard to figure out what those things are far enough in advance sometimes with the economy changing so fast.
I mean, it can be tricky. Yeah. And that's a challenge. It's an interesting challenge, and
Yeah. Especially if you think then also what's going to be automated and what's going to be not automated as another factor in terms of like what people are going to need to
Sure.
actually be able to do.
Yeah, Richard.
Also, there are different types of learning that, well, our current education system doesn't, deal with it all. There's like kinetic types of learning, and there's verbal.
Learning styles,
learning styles, yes. We don't have that at all.
Right.
I'm just curious what people think can be automated. They're the obvious ones that have been
Yeah.
in a lot of conversations, but what other jobs that you might not expect will be automated? And then also, what jobs do you think can be re-educated? Do you think, as I was just watching a video of Yuval Noah Harari
Yeah.
last night, he was saying you could re-educate a truck driver to be a yoga teacher.
Right.
How likely is that?
Spend a lot of time sitting. Not likely.
Yeah.
I
So
don't think that's the same
I mean-
methodology.
There's always going to be.
That's a good question.
So it's a matter of what the rate of retraining is. Like, there's always going to be someone who's a truck driver who could be, retrained to be a yoga teacher.
Right.
There's also always going to be people who are truck drivers who it's not really feasible for them ever to become yoga teachers. And I think it depends on what kind of jobs we're talking about. But
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
so I think there's like two parts. I'll answer your second question first too, which is that I mean, there's some things that just take a tremendous amount of time, and like being a doctor, for example, or whatever, might take a lot of time to retrain. So, or maybe it's this person just doesn't have the skills. But then there's another factor that I think we think about less, which is does the economy really need your labor? And if not, you're competing with other people. And so it's not, let's say it was like football player, right? If this truck driver, you might be able to train him to like play football now, but he's so far behind, let alone ability, there's no way he can compete with the NFL players, and you only need so many NFL players. And I think more jobs are like that than people realize. So with like yoga teachers, like we only need so many yoga teachers. Is the guy who's having to be retrained, who never chose to be a yoga teacher in the first place, and like is 40 years into has already trained to be a truck, like is he going to be a competitive candidate for yoga teaching compared to the people who have trained for longer? And I suspect that this is part of one of the reasons that like retraining programs don't work very well empirically. Is like it's not that you can't learn to do some other skill. It's like the economy doesn't need everyone to do that skill, and you're competing with people who already trained for it like for a while already and maybe had it more as a natural skill set.
Right.
So the poor truck driver is like losing something that was his comparative advantage that he already has a ton of experience and practice with, and he's just not going to be at as competitive a level at most new jobs.
right.
Does that make sense?
And
Also, as things disappear, the retraining probably has more to do with how do people, what do people do with their lives without jobs?
Right.
Because I think there's going to be more jobs disappearing than the ones that we know about now. So retraining in that sense doesn't make sense either, because what you retrain for, I mean, maybe there'll be a robot yoga teacher.
Right.
I mean, we don't know what's coming up, but
Yeah.
it's coming
Yeah.
fast.
In response to your first question, like,
Can I just
yeah.
speak to the point you just made, which is that most truck drivers are not going to be able to become yoga teachers, as Bethany said. We don't even need extra yoga teachers, perhaps. But like for the truck driver that does successfully become a yoga teacher, is he going to knock another yoga teacher out of that job, right?
Right,
Like,
that's the other.
yeah.
person.
So I just wanted to point that out, and then if you have people competing for jobs that they don't really want to do in the first place, then you might end
That's
up.
what we have now.
Well, yeah. We're imagining a world without basic income. Yeah. If you have people, like maybe there are some people who would really, really love to work at Walmart. Like that would make them really happy. But I read about a Walmart that was opening up in DC a couple years ago, and in terms of the number of people who applied and the number of people who got jobs, it was harder to get into Walmart than it was to get into Harvard.
What?
The percentage of people who
Why?
applied compared to the percentage of people who got accepted for a job. I mean, obviously there are people who just wouldn't apply to Harvard, right? And there are a ton of people applying to all kinds of jobs willy-nilly. But I found that comparison striking, and it also struck me that a lot of these people who are winning the jobs are not necessarily the best people for the job. They're doing the job because they need it, because they're
Right,
desperate.
right. So you're losing information, like you're losing what people would choose to do
Right.
if they had more options.
Right.
Yeah.
If you have a basic income, then that's going to help filter out all the people who don't really want to be working in the first place. Like a lot of people are worried that basic income might make people lazy, but the flip side of that is that basic income filters the lazy people out of the workforce, helps the labor force be more efficient.
Would you rather have the person who's like has a gun to their head flipping burgers, or the person who wants to have whose only reward is to see that smile on their on their customer's
Right.
face or whatever? That's the example.
Yeah, exactly.
But all these truck drivers don't have to work anymore. Are going to need stuff to do.
Right.
Yeah.
And maybe we're going to need a lot more like pro
Presumably, they're
Sports teams.
D&D.
Ooh.
Dungeon Master.
One thing about the automation conversation is that it's very binary in the fact we talk about jobs being replaced or continuing, or
Right.
jobs that are safe and jobs that aren't safe, and that's just not the way it's going to be.
Right.
Because accountants might lose 40% of their work, but they're still an
Right.
accountant. And I think, as an artist, I can speak that I already work with automated tools. I work with After Effects, and I'm doing part of it, but I can train the computer to do another part of it. And I think that is analogous to a lot of
Like
other
you don't
jobs.
need
train.
like you don't need a dark room for your camera anymore.
Yeah. The whole
How did you
digital-
mean when you say train a computer?
So I create graphics, and I can create what I want to repeat itself once.
Right.
That makes
You
sense.
program the effect. Yeah.
Yeah, that change took place
Are
in
you,
my lifetime.
are you familiar
also.
with generative AI?
Well, just tell me what it is.
Well, so, an example of giving a textual description of something like a flower, and then the AI generates a flower,
Mhm.
a
Yeah.
photorealistic.
Yeah, I've seen like musical
text.
compositions. Yeah, I've never been too impressed, but yeah.
It's only 2019.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is.
And I think I just want to speak to the 40% thing. So if you imagine that we have all the doctors we need, for example, and then you automate 40% of a doctor's work, it's not just that all those doctors are going to stay doctors and do 40% less work. What's probably going to happen is that you're going to have 40% less doctors, and the remaining doctors are going to be the best doctors, and they're going to be working more efficiently, that kind of thing.
There's like right now there's Watson, and it's doing like looks through millions of cases of cancer, and it provides these are the most likely options that this patient's cancer is likely to be. Or
I think Watson has been actually somewhat of a disappointment to most people who know about it. Yeah,
It was good on Jeopardy.
he was good on Jeopardy. Yeah, go ahead.
I attend a lot of events where IBM continues to, I'll say promote Watson. I was at one earlier this week. I would agree with you sort of in the sense that it's a disappointment that it is not caught on necessarily as well as obviously IBM would have liked.
Right.
But I think it likely has more to do with just part of what Watson is competing, the environment in which Watson is competing, is this notion of everything is for free. We're on the free model. Facebook is free, Google is free, and so I think there's a little element of that IBM is sort of, and I'll use IBM, but there are lots of areas where Watson is quite successful.
So you said Google is
Making
Google is free, Facebook is free, Instagram is free. There have been ideas out there that they should write you a check for the time that you spend on there.
Absolutely,
and
yeah.
Do you
But what I'm
think
saying
that's
is
a
that-
good idea?
I think that's a really terrible idea. I think people people's behavior is a response to kind of their incentives, and people are using the product, because they're getting the benefit from the product. So you're getting the benefit from the use of Facebook, and Facebook is collecting data, sure, but if you're not happy with that, you don't have to use Facebook. Like, and this is true kind of for the labor market in general. In an efficient labor market, you shouldn't have to pay people for things they're going to do on their own, because the point of wages is to incentivize people to spend their time doing something other than what they'd normally be doing. So if people are already using Facebook, why do you need to pay them to use Facebook? And you can come up with all kinds of moral arguments and stuff like that, but it doesn't really make that much economic sense.
I will say, you say you don't have to use Facebook if you don't want to. That's not completely true. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm in a college right now, and everything is on Facebook.
Oh yeah, we
Every
just
event,
moved this
every-
meeting to Facebook.
So,
Yeah.
so do we really have choice there?
I mean, I think that's a good point. In terms of paying people for the data that's collected,
Is that what
I don't-
it would be?
I
That
guess.
might create a strange
There are a couple
incentive
other
to
models
spend
around that.
Yeah,
to spend like a lot of time on Facebook though. Like I would worry about the effect of that.
Right.
So it-
people already
Spend more
feel like they
time
spend
because-
enough time on
Yeah.
Facebook.
So there are a couple issues. One is that it might break Facebook's business model, and then
Well, yeah,
it's
then
no
there is
longer
no
a
more
viable
Facebook.
business. That kind of thing. Because the data only has value in like its massive, collected form. It's not like Bethany's data has value. It's Bethany's data combined with millions of other people's data has value. It's the data set that has value.
Well, the other
Yeah.
interesting thing is that it's a form of play for most people. And play, once it's done experiments with people playing, once they get paid to do something that they're playing at, they don't really want to do it that much anymore.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
a disincentive to pay them.
It can be.
Yeah.
And there'd be
I-
a bunch of people like trying to make money on there, which would ruin it as a social
Right,
platform because they would be doing other behaviors and
Yeah.
masquerading as who knows what. Should I get the
How much
maximum
am I
money?
earning? How
Yeah.
much time? Yeah.
I think
It changed the whole thing.
I think Liam brings up a good point that for a lot of people it's not a choice
Right.
to use Facebook. So then the question is, how do we want to respond to that? So it's almost like a utility that
Yeah.
people use.
Right.
So then maybe
Yeah.
should the government step in and regulate something, and because it's managed for the benefit of the people, that kind of thing. These are interesting questions. I don't know that the answer is to pay people
We're
to
kind of
use
far
it.
afield from this, but like one part of the answer to
Yeah.
that question would be like how easily can people switch to something else? And my sense is like
Right.
moderately easily in the sense that I've heard, and you might be able to tell me more than I know, but like I've heard that like teenagers now are not using Facebook as much. And so it's possible that like with enough information, if people really hate the use of their data, they actually can change to something else. The difficulty
Yeah.
there is that there's a network effect, like if other people are on it, you have to be on it. So that's sort of what works against that.
Just yesterday, Stephen Colbert did a segment on Late Show or whatever it is that most young people are on Instagram and things like that. While Trump is targeting people who are over 65 on Facebook because that's what many of the people are on. And like he said, did this like joke, there's 3 Nancys from Nevada. And
So another question is, if the government wants everybody to have money and everybody's using Facebook, does the using of Facebook have to be the reason why you give people money? Like we want people to have more spending money. I mean, like this is basic income, right? Like we want people to be able to spend as much money as possible to get the most benefit out of the economy. Does it make sense that money should be coming from Facebook, or that we should force that money to come from Facebook? And it's the same question of, do we want to force that money to come from employers for people working at their jobs? And I don't know. I mean, there's kind of like a moral arguments for why people deserve to be paid because Facebook is benefiting, for why people deserve to be paid kind of for their labor, that kind of thing. But it doesn't provide necessarily an economic benefit to people. They could just as easily be getting the money, perhaps even more money, directly from the government as a basic income.
Well, it could provide an economic benefit to people, and I think it's
In the
actually
sense that,
so. People think of the data that people are collecting on them when they see an advertisement on Facebook.
yeah.
Their initial reaction sometimes is that it's creepy and they don't want it. Actually, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe you wouldn't have found out about that
I
hammock
like
with the
it.
specific
Yeah.
parts that you want. And I think one thing you all Noah Harari talks about in his books and in that video is
Yeah.
using these algorithms to tell us things about ourselves that we wouldn't have been able to find out about ourselves. He didn't know he was gay until he was 21, and now Stanford has developed an algorithm that can apparently tell someone that's gay with 91% accuracy with a few pictures of their face. And same with healthcare. If you can offer your Fitbit data, your heart rate data over the course of 7 years, and that decreases your chance of having a disease that kills you, why not give them the data and reap the benefits of what they can tell you?
So maybe there's an argument to be made for opening up the data, so that it can be used for more benefit. That's tricky because it's a powerful thing, right? And it could also be used against people and all that. Yeah, I mean, these are interesting questions.
Like the genetic discrimination about how there's like a few years ago there's a law in Congress about how if you allow employers to use your have you take a genetic test and then they can use that for your to like decide how much you pay for healthcare or and things like that.
Yeah.
Or if you even get hired in the first place, or if you're gonna get a promotion, like how high of a chance are you going to have a heart attack if you get a promotion or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I mean that's an interesting question, and it also kind of brings us back to the question of why do we care so much about jobs being automated? Why do we care so much about people being discriminated against in the labor force? You know, all these kinds of things, and you know,
those are really different questions.
Is it?
Yes.
What was the first question?
Why do we care about jobs being automated?
Okay. Yeah. So in my mind, I have this kind of overarching question, which is, you know, yeah.
Like we were doing with Iran, how the wealthy people didn't like that they received something like a basic income because the poor people received something like basic income because they didn't want to work anymore. And so if people don't want the poor to receive a basic income because they want to have a serf class to do their bidding for them.
Yes. So I guess my overarching question was, why do we care about people in their capacity as workers? Yes.
So I guess one thing that we might still care about in a world with a basic income, which is obviously opposite from what we're doing here, but is like, you know, people, it's one of the ways people find meaning and purpose, and like, so long as there are jobs, that will probably be the case. So you might care about like that from the perspective of those people working there. I think your second question about discrimination also raises other questions for consumers. Like, do you want the best people in the job for the job in the job, right? Or do you want like random things, like, you know, not random, but do you want like other norms that are kind of distorting the labor market in a different way? Discrimination to be operating. That's why I thought that was a different question.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I think that's right. I think there can be kind of inefficiencies in the labor market that are caused by this kind of discrimination, and that businesses aren't performing as well as they could be if that weren't there. That kind of thing. Yeah. But that's not how we usually are thinking about these issues. We're usually thinking about them from the perspective of the worker. And like Liam was saying, like if jobs get automated, can you retrain people? Like, why do we care about that question? Why is that question important? And I think it's important because we live in a world without basic income. We live in a world where people are expected to get their incomes from jobs, and then it's a bad thing if you can't retrain for a different job or something like that. Yeah, and this is not, you know, it's not a new problem, right? There's no law of economics that says that people's incomes from jobs will somehow automatically match the level of consumer spending that the economy can productively respond to. So, you know, I think the whole automation story, it's kind of highlighting a problem that's been with us for hundreds of years, and for hundreds of years we've had all kinds of problems with this expectation that people's labor somehow has this fundamental value and deserves to be paid, and you know, that kind of thing. We've had labor movements and changes in labor policy, minimum wage, all this kind of stuff as a way of forcing people incomes through the labor market.
And there's like in a few months ago, the the hotel workers had a strike, and they wanted like a 6-month warning that something was going to be automated, and they wanted a living wage and things like that.
Yeah.
But if you have a basic income, there's less of a need for that. But or you can look at it the Stop and Shop strike could have gone on indefinitely if they had a basic income, because they already had it. They had like a strike fund.
Yeah.
To respond to what you're
Yeah,
saying
go ahead.
about why do we care,
Yeah.
people want to feel like they have value. That's
Yeah.
basic. But also, this isn't the first time that automation has happened. That needs to be a part of the conversation. Before turnstiles existed, there was actually someone taking your ticket and letting you in. I mean, horses probably weren't too happy about cars coming around. They didn't have as much value anymore. And the same thing. I don't want to say that I don't believe that history repeats itself, but I think that there are themes that repeat themselves. So I don't think we should look back at all the automations that have happened in the past and say, well, we're just going to find new jobs in the future. But we need to find new ways to give people a sense of value in what they're doing. And
Yeah.
maybe that isn't work. And I think that kind of came through the conversation earlier.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great point. And a question we can ask is, why do we value people? Do we value people because of the labor that they contribute to society, or do we value people because they're people?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Right.
add on to that is like, we sometimes think of it as coming from the individual only, this idea that my value comes from my work, but it probably doesn't, right? It comes from the broader society. People are valued according to partly to their work. And this is partly because if you don't have work, you're poor, and like your social status is entirely dependent on it, right? So I guess all this is to say, like, I think it might surprise people that how easily you could transition to a different way that people found value.
Right.
So women is a great example of this in reverse, right? I'm really happy that women are participating in the workforce, but before that, their sense of value didn't necessarily come from a job. And like for now, for a lot of women, it does, right? So it kind of depends, and that depended heavily on the social expectations. Like, are you supposed to work or not to be a valuable person, right? So anyway, just as one example.
Yeah.
We confuse, these aren't my words, but we confuse economic value with human value.
Right.
And that's a big problem with our system
Yeah.
as it is now.
Yeah, we think that your human value is related to how much you get paid or something like that. Whereas, there's plenty of work that people do that is incredibly valuable to society,
Right.
that nobody's paying them to do because it's valuable to them too, and they want to do it anyway.
Right.
Like the work that's most valuable to the person doing it is the work that is going to be
least to
you
it's
pay
kind of
gets paid the
paradoxical, but,
least.
like,
Yeah.
There's a quote from "The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world."
Right, exactly. Yeah, like parenting is a great example of this. Like parenting is super valuable, but because people are intrinsically motivated to do it, you don't really have to pay them anything to get them to do it, right? So its economic value is really different from its
Right.
its
Like,
human value.
Yeah.
well, there's a historical example, like the beginning in 1066 with William the Conqueror. He was French, and for hundreds of years, the French, the main language of the court was French, but they had all these, English-speaking peasants that were taking care of the royal children, and over time they spoke more. The royal children learned more and more English, and so it became the predominant language.
So Jacqueline has a few comments on the live stream. She says, why do people get retrained? Because most people actually want jobs. Having a job means being socially included. This is why so many housewives and retirees seek out volunteer work. So I think that's a great point. So a question we might ask is, if we've solved the income problem through like a basic income, then if people still want jobs, maybe there are some people we should just make up work for them to do and have them do it. I don't think that's the answer for everyone. And then I think, speaking to what Bethany was saying before, where you partly derive your meaning and purpose based on what society is expecting of you. If those expectations change, then will as many people want a job, or will they think of how they spend their time as a job or as work, as that kind of thing. So I mean, it's an exciting challenge, figuring out how to help people live their best lives, help people get the most meaning and purpose out of their lives. But I think we should actually ask these questions instead of just assuming that the job route is the way to go. And kind of to what Liam was saying before about automation has happened before, is this time different? That kind of stuff. I mean, we always have the ability to make up work for people to do. Like, the nightmare scenario isn't that robots take all the jobs. The nightmare scenario is that we make up useless work for people to do and force people to do it, which is more of a continuation of the status quo, where we're trying to create jobs as a way of getting incomes to people, or providing them meaning and purpose, so for the benefit of the worker, instead of because there's labor that needs doing. So something that's being talked about in political circles these days is the idea of a federal jobs guarantee. So this would literally be guaranteeing everyone a job, making up work for them to do, and forcing them, using that as a way to get them the income. Now, there's an argument to be made that some of this work is useful, but if work is useful, then you need to be creating it for the purpose of getting the work done. As soon as you start creating jobs for the purpose of giving people incomes, now you're not doing it for the purpose of doing work that needs to be done. There's plenty of stuff we should be spending money on, infrastructure, all that kind of stuff. And of course, in an efficient economy, we would want to accomplish all that stuff using as little labor as possible. Yeah.
Let me ask you about infrastructure, though. Whatever happened to, I thought it was bipartisan support for a large infrastructure fund.
Yeah.
Assuming that these construction repair jobs are mostly semi-skilled, unskilled,
Yeah.
there would be, it could employ a lot of unemployed people.
Sure.
Does anybody know whatever happened to that?
It's that they don't want the president of the time to get the credit for it, so they get reelected.
Okay.
And so they don't want the
Political.
yes, it's entirely political, and because, well, increasingly there's technologies that would make it more efficient. Like in India, they have really poor. They create all these poor, rotten, like roads and things like that, so that they have an excuse to have all these jobs. So they keep replacing these roads every few years.
Oh, okay.
Well,
Planned obsolescence.
yes, something like that, but for roads. But within the last few years, there's like technologies where if there's a cracks in say concrete, there's this bacteria that's mixed in with the concrete that you draw in CO2 from the air to create like limestone to fill in the cracks. So that would just eliminate the need for but and there's also a way to like fill in the cracks in the existing infrastructure with the bacteria. So
Pretty cool. That's another thing, like in a world with basic income, hopefully we would see like progress happen faster, because there wouldn't be all these like perverse incentives like giving people work to do instead of fight against it.
I don't think infrastructure isn't being worked on because it is political, but I don't think that's not political. It isn't. I mean, I think it's probably that other things are more, not glamorous, but more attention-getting, and that's the kind of thing that people want to pass bills on and sign on to. I mean, they've been talking for years about it being a bipartisan thing.
Yeah.
Everybody wants it to happen. But having said all that, that's not what they really are trying to do, because it's not going to really give them the kind of flashy thing for their party that they want. Anti-immigration policy will give you that. The stuff that's really exciting and gets votes is not about working on infrastructure. Everybody agrees that's to do. Yeah,
Well,
we should do that.
Maybe it's a combination, like the stuff that's exciting and that you don't have to run by the other party is the stuff that
That's
gets
true.
through.
That's true too.
So, like I think the other party, I think what Richard said is probably right, that maybe the other party doesn't want the party in power to get anything exciting done that
I mean, get the infrastructure thing done?
Or anything
Anything at
flashy,
all.
exciting, or that they can show off that they did something, like
Right.
that helped everybody, that kind of thing.
Like
that makes
Eisenhower
sense.
with the whole constructing highways and things like that in the
Yeah.
early
But
50s.
Alex, how does that
Yeah.
explain why when like Republicans did they have control of Congress and the presidency for a
They
couple
still
years,
don't. Right.
and then they didn't pass infrastructure?
It depends what you mean, because they
What?
never had like a supermajority in the Senate, did they?
I don't
No,
know.
they had like 58.
Yeah, like 58. So you need to have in order to just pass bills willy nilly, you need to have kind of a veto.
Right, but this does.
Or actually, yeah, I guess
This can't
No,
be a full explanation then. Because then you would say like what? Then no one would ever do anything according to this explanation unless they had a supermajority, and like
no, you're right, because the Republicans had Congress and
Yes.
the presidency,
Right.
so they weren't going to get
Democrats
vetoed
were-
either.
Didn't
Yeah.
even under Obama, the Democrats had both for a while.
Yeah.
They didn't do
Um,
infrastructure.
right.
And
I don't know.
they-
These
feel
are
like his
And they
point is
couldn't.
still
They
there.
had the chance to, pass a healthcare bill,
Oh,
their
yeah.
own repeal and replace or whatever, and they didn't need to veto it or anything like that, and they still couldn't pass it.
yeah. I'm kind of out of my depth here in terms of like the political
Yeah, same. I don't really know.
machinations that are preventing.
I studied political science.
Okay.
Oh, cool.
Cool.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Can I make one more point based on what Jacqueline said?
yeah.
Like you often list three things that we expect jobs to do, which is like purpose. Well, you know your three. But
Yeah.
one that you don't often list is like social connection and social network. But I feel like
So
Jacqueline
that-
was also
that
kind
falls-
of highlighting that.
So that falls into benefit for the workers. So the three things that I usually list are they're really two things in my mind, but the three things are that we expect from the labor market are efficient allocation of labor, the incomes for consumers, and then meaning and purpose for workers. So I'd say it kind of falls into that third category of something that's there to benefit the worker, which is really the last two things. So there's efficient allocation of labor and then stuff for the workers. And the question is, how much labor market efficiency do you want to sacrifice in order to benefit the workers? And I think if we, instead of thinking of people as workers, but think of them as consumers, we can focus on, providing them incomes through a basic income and allow the labor market to be efficient. And in terms of meaning and purpose and also, social inclusion, that kind of stuff, we want to figure out ways to do that. But again, we want to expand our options beyond just, the labor market, the existing labor market. That's not to say that we won't come up with something that looks similar to what we have now, but we want to be able to explore all the possibilities there. We can start by allowing the labor market to be efficient, and then think about how to solve the income problem, how to solve the meaning and purpose problem. And they're not really problems; they're challenges, right? Like there's all kinds of possibilities for how to make people's lives interesting and how to help them find the most out of their life.
Well, volunteering is mentioned, and that's
Yeah.
definitely.
So volunteering, and maybe you think of that as a job, maybe you don't.
But
It's
it's a connection.
yeah.
It's purpose.
yeah, and there can be social clubs. Maybe you participate in a sports league or D&D or
When I was
like
in-
there's all kinds of
When I was in
possibilities.
Thailand, I met someone
Yeah.
who said that he felt that travel was his job. He was like a younger person, learning about all these different
Okay.
cultures,
So, yeah.
exploring things. Yeah.
Yeah.
He had a kind of a way to make money on his computer while he did it, but he saw travel as kind of a big thing.
Cool.
And a lot of people from Europe do travel, like young people from Europe travel a lot more.
Right.
Yeah.
than we do.
So the next thing that Jacqueline says is that Bernie Sanders' federal jobs guarantee proposal also includes a basic income for those who either don't want to work or who are unable to work. But those of us who want jobs will finally get included, and that's a good thing. So that's really interesting. I have never heard that before. I would be interested if you have a link, Jacqueline, that you could find that describes this, and you want to post it on the live chat while we're still going. I'd be interested in reading about that. It's not consistent with my understanding of what he's trying to accomplish. And
I've
it's
heard that he isn't against the basic income. He just prefers a job guarantee.
yeah. I mean, obviously, I think the job guarantee is the nightmare scenario, but yeah.
I wanted to answer his automation question, but now he's out. So
Oh, okay.
never got to that. But.
All right. So I think just more to Jacqueline's point that I'm skeptical of this Bernie Sanders thing, but you don't, if you only need something like a jobs guarantee if you're creating jobs for the benefit of the workers, and I think people are people, and if you're forcing people to be workers, then you're kind of limiting their freedom, and you'd only really want people to work if we need work that if we have work that needs doing. I think
if whether or not it's true that this is part of Sanders' proposal, it's true that they're not mutually exclusive ideas.
Right.
You could have a basic income. If you had a basic income, it would probably be much easier to run a jobs guarantee program because you wouldn't have as many people
Wanting to do it.
with the jobs.
for jobs.
Yeah, and maybe the job guarantee program, it doesn't look like what we think of now as a job. Like maybe there's no minimum wage or something like that. Like here's just a list of activities you can do, and some of them are useful to people, and you can choose among them, that kind of thing.
And actually, in India, I sent you an article about this.
Yeah.
They have people are guaranteed 180 days of it's like a rural work program of work or something like that, but they have trouble finding enough work for 100 days for most of the people. So
Then that's why they have them do like the inefficient roads and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have a comment about automation?
Oh, we just never fully answered your question about like which things we thought would be automated or not. I guess the way that I think about it, like I tend to think more in terms of order, like which things are going to be automated earlier than others, because I really don't feel like I know what the limit is of it. I guess the things that like would be the hardest are the things where humans actually care that the other person is a human or like is sentient. So maybe like a therapist, like maybe people care, maybe they don't. I don't know.
but people there's studies that say that people are more willing to tell things to robots than they
so
are
bad
to
example for that one.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to think of one where like you wouldn't care that it's a person. I mean, maybe like your relationship partner, like it's kind of a weird one to think about. But
A lot of people care about doctors being people.
Some people care about
that.
their doctor being a person, or at least one of their healthcare workers.
Right.
I just think some more about like which ones. Those would be the last to go.
Well, as far as healthcare goes, it's doctors are going to be automated away, but nurses are going to stay.
Mm.
Already surgeons are being automated away.
Right.
And the part of doctoring where you take in information from the patient and then compare it to all possible diseases
So much better done by a machine.
is very easily automated.
Right.
But the bedside manner and the human touch has to stay.
It's sort of like that segment in Idiocracy, the movie, where the person like goes up to the robot and he says, "You have a bunch of STDs and things like that," and he's like, "Oh man."
I haven't seen that.
Yeah.
One thing that we've talked about this about
Yeah.
automating creative work, creative writing. I mean,
Yeah.
and you talked a little bit about art and how that's, in a way, there's automation involved. I mean, I've seen that whole digital revolution, and I just recently found a T-square in the house. Remember that? Yeah, you used it for graphic. You used it for drawing boards, for graphic design. Tell you through the lines, shaped like a T. It's long and wooden. So that's gone. But writing, I think about because I'm a writer. So, and Alex was telling me about software called narrative software. I think we had that discussion.
Oh, the GPT-2?
Where I couldn't tell the difference.
The
between
unicorns?
a human author and
The
a machine
unicorns?
author.
Yeah.
And some things are being automated. Writing is being automated.
Yeah.
If you think about writing as art, then the fact that it is so arbitrary or abstract that it can mean subjective, means things to different people.
Right.
That it's wonderful in that way, but in terms of writing as communication, it's actually a really terrible and inefficient way of getting an idea from one person's mind to another.
Well, I think even in art, though, I disagree that it is subjective on one dimension, but the other dimensions require craft and require, I mean, you can't just sit down, most people think they can, you can't sit down and write a little bit long. It does take some kind of craft and knowledge and progression. But I think that that can be probably taught to a machine.
Sure.
And so then the question is, like I don't know if you remember this conversation, then the question is it as valuable if you know?
Right.
Like to a collector.
Yeah.
Would a collector care if it was created by a machine?
Well,
or would it need to be
chess reminds, so like my friend made me think of chess the other day, with this code, so like computers beat humans with chess now.
Right.
And Go. Right. But don't humans still have tournaments, right? Or like machines can move faster than a human, but we still
Right.
have running.
Right.
So I think there are like some
Yes.
aspects of performance where like we
Yeah.
just like to see what a human is capable of.
So that's
And
where
it's-
you want
it's-
the human.
I would say even more strongly.
Right, but I guess my point is a little bit different from that, which is there are some things where even if you were to automate them, people are fascinated at like how good a person can get at them.
Right.
So they'll always want to know like what a person can do.
Right.
So like even if a machine is better, like with
Yeah.
chess, like you
Yeah.
still want to know like what is a person capable of. Who's
So,
the best person.
I think there's a stronger answer to the question of people valuing art that was done by a human, and I think you can look at it by just looking at people value that if you have a piece of art and you tell them that it was done by a certain person, they're going to value it a lot
That's
more
true, yes.
than
That's right.
if you told them it was done by a different non-famous person or something like that. And there was this.
I've done that study.
Right, and there was this thing I think you told me about where there was this really famous musician who went and played in the subway, and people just
Joshua Bell. I think.
yeah Joshua Bell, and people
Right.
just walked by him, and like
without context,
yeah,
and they didn't know how to
right,
value it.
exactly.
Right.
So there's certainly that dimension to it, and I think there's always going to be a market for like human created goods, or I mean like even if you think about like handmade goods,
Yeah.
homemade cookies,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Carpentry, craft.
Yeah, I mean, you could have
Boat
this
building.
this perfectly constructed machine-made bowl or something like that. And then you could have something that maybe isn't even quite as good, but that was
Yeah.
made by a person,
Oh my God,
and
I have
people
so many
value that.
examples of this. So
Yeah.
like when automation, speaking of other examples, past automations, like when the Industrial Revolution hit, there were all these art movements, like the arts and crafts movement, that wanted to make furniture that was like handmade, and they would like do these sort of like techniques that a machine couldn't do, like a square peg, and the machines always use round ones, or you could see the like hammer marks, whereas they used to like try to make it smooth before there was automation. And
Right.
now you want to like see
Yeah.
that it's hammered. So
Right.
there are these things, and they tend to be explained at least by me by like cost. Those are like costly signaling. Like it's more expensive to have like a handmade thing. So then
Right.
the handmade
So
thing
even if you really
becomes
can't tell the
really
difference,
fancy.
but somebody tells you,
Yeah,
this,
exactly.
then it becomes more
Yeah.
valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's human, made by a human.
yeah, that's right.
I was also surprised and pleased to learn that most lawyers are going to be automated. Because you remember then wheeling is, a lot of lawyering is document search.
Yeah. Oh
I've
my
seen them
gosh.
with the
Oh, yeah.
hand trucks of the boxes
Oh,
of
yeah.
documents. Well, now that all the documents are electronic or can be made electronic, all the searching is done by computers, and you just need the litigators to finish up the job.
So the State House actually, if you do a freedom of information request to the Massachusetts State House, they still have someone going
Oh my
in your
gosh.
basement, and
wow.
for
Why?
whatever reason everything isn't. But I'm of the generation I've always had Command F,
Yeah.
and
Right. It's good.
which is incredible that I've always been able to
What's
just
Command F?
search.
It's
Sorry.
Control
Sorry,
F
I don't-
Oh,
I don't-
for you.
Control F.
I
Yeah,
don't mean to-
he's on a
it's
Mac,
just-
so.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's basically just search for any word.
Right.
I
No,
don't
she
have to
knows.
read
She knows.
through
There's just a
whole
different
article.
Yeah.
key pressing.
Yeah.
I didn't
Okay.
know about
I'm sorry.
that.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. It's,
That's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally there's nothing that can't be automated, and we ourselves are biological machines, right? So there's no reason to think that that there's anything out there that couldn't be done by a machine, couldn't be done by automation, and that's not a bad thing. That's great,
Although
right?
there gets to be a point where like
Yeah.
some things maybe the machine would have to be like so sophisticated that it would have like consciousness and rights and basically be a person. So like I guess that's kind of an interesting distinction.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Then it's not cheaper anymore, right? Or like then it's just like a person again.
yeah. Yeah, it depends if you're automating like specific tasks or jobs, or you're trying to automate life and consciousness and that kind of thing.
A lot of things
I mean,
have
it could be
already-
done. It could be done,
A
right?
lot of things
Yeah.
have already been automated. I mean, over
Right.
the years.
Yeah.
Toll
So, I mean-
takers, bank tellers. I mean, we're kind of incorporating as we go.
Yeah, and I think
It's
this.
really-
Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
You can even automate government. Well, in Evangelion, there's 3. I keep bringing this example
Yeah,
up, where there's 3 supercomputers, the Magi, that can the are aspects of their creator, the woman, the scientist, and the mother, and the woman in this episode where there's being hacked by these aliens. The woman wins, that is the only one that holds out.
Yeah, so I mean, I think part of the reason we fear automation instead of embracing it is it has to do with this income thing.
Yeah.
That people are getting their incomes from the labor market. It also has to do with the meaning and purpose stuff and all of that. But part of the reason that our society is structuring people's meaning and purpose around the labor market has to do with these other, it has to do with income and money and
a nice
stuff like that.
contrast
Yeah.
is how we feel about things that are automating just like our household chores. Like
Yeah.
we usually don't feel bad about like the
No.
washing
Right.
machine or like something that allows you to clean faster or cook more easily.
Yeah.
The microwave, because we just get that time back and we're
Right.
not
Yeah.
losing anything. But with like a job,
Yeah.
I think we should just be careful about talking about automation and AI as these things that are like coming or the wave that it's already
It's here.
Yeah,
it's
Yeah.
here
Yeah.
and it
No,
just
I agree.
my lenses have autofocus on
Yeah.
them. That's on automation.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
if I pointed at something, it'll automatically focus on.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of when you dial a number, that's an auto.
I didn't, this is new to me. I mean, I didn't grow up with anything like this. A little
Yeah.
computer in my hand.
Yeah, and I mean throughout history we've had technological advancement.
Right.
And technology, fundamentally, it allows us to use resources more efficiently. That includes labor, it includes everything. And if we weren't worried about this specific thing of how people are going to get their incomes, we would embrace it. Like Bethany said, if you have something that's automated and just makes something easier for you, that's great. But we're not celebrating it in the same way at the level of the whole
I
society.
think there's another aspect
Yeah.
to it, and Ian has talked about this.
Yeah.
The whole idea of AI to the limit, that Stephen Hawking talked about, and the singularity, the whole idea of the blending of biological and mechanical.
Cyborgs.
We're already cyborgs.
We were
but more
cyborgs.
so. I mean, that there is then the danger of being not overtaken, but outstripped, so that artificial
Do I know?
intelligence, could be learned, teaching itself without us having to be
Sure.
controlling it.
So
that's a
what's the
fear.
problem?
That's a fear.
What's the problem?
Well, that's not about jobs. What's the
The
problem?
fear is like
Yeah.
I don't know, like a
We
AI
don't know.
apocalypse
It could
or
murder
whatever.
us.
Like,
It could murder
We don't
us.
know what the
Exactly, the AI
ethical.
apocalypse.
We don't know what the ethics
Fear.
of that would be. It might just be indifference. We're indifferent to ants. I don't know.
There's
Decide
a,
we're bad and then wipe us out.
there's a story about like there's the gray goo scenario, and there's also like you could
The gray-
the
What's that?
Self-replicating nanobots that just replicate themselves, consume everything else.
Is that like the day the earth stood still?
I don't know.
The little bugs that
and there's another one where with the paper clips. We're going to make as many paper clips as possible.
play that game?
Yeah.
No, paper what?
Oh, there's a game version of that. It's very addictive.
It's called Grey Goose.
Gray goo.
Yeah, so I think
Oh,
this
Grey
is
Goo.
Yeah, so it's just everything gets turned into this gray goo because the nanites just keep replicating
Right.
themselves and covering the whole planet. Yeah.
Right. So there's like opportunities for things to go horribly awry, as with many new technologies. So that is
Sure.
a separate fear from the job fear.
Yeah.
It's like the fear of like, nuclear power, but nuclear holocaust. It's that kind of fear. The
Yes.
technology
Right, okay.
going awry in unpredictable
Yeah.
or predictable, difficult ways that
Right.
you don't want to have
They're two
happen.
different fears.
Sure.
But they're still
So
fears.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's not just a job fear.
Basic
It's
income
my
doesn't
point.
help with that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
I don't want to keep going off of basic
Yeah.
income, but to Harari again talks
Yeah.
about first of all the idea of cyborgs. We already all are cyborgs. If you have a question, you ask your smartphone, what's the difference between that and being a good brain? Or and then the other, I want to bring up the question.
There's an argument that we were cyborgs centuries ago with like glasses and things.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
But, the question of if he uses the example of North Korea, but anywhere, England, China, starts genetically engineering brilliant. They engineer babies to be brilliant mathematicians and artists, and what? How does a different country or the United States, anyone else, say, well, we're not going to do that? but they're doing it, and if you're competing in the global market, if they can still compete, they can still apply to schools abroad, and they can still.
There's actually an anime of that, Gundam Seed and Gundam Seed Destiny, where there's a class who live in space. They're coordinators, and you know about that?
No,
In Destiny, there's this ruler who assigns people their positions by their genetic makeup and things like that. And so, he tests this one person, and you'll make an ideal fighter. So we're going to give you this giant robot so you can fight with it, and you are going to help us defeat everyone else, like the non-coordinators, the naturals that they're called.
So yeah, I mean, I think this is a problem that basic income doesn't solve, except maybe to the extent that if we were able to kind of unify the global economy more, so that it's less, different nations kind of competing against each other, then that could help. So if we had like a global basic income where everyone was a citizen of humanity and they all received kind of the same basic income, maybe that would bring nations together, and there'd be less of a concern of having to compete on, destructive technology, that kind of stuff, including genetic engineering.
Also, it's not solved by basic income. It's basically a problem of morality and ethics. So what do people value? If you just want to experiment, then without thinking about the consequences, that it doesn't have to do with competition necessarily. It just has to do with a lack of caring about the consequences.
Yeah, but I mean, if you imagined that we lived in a global economy with one government and that kind of thing, maybe the entire global government would regulate that,
Right.
that kind of thing. So that would be the extent to which the lessened competition, the lack of competition between nations, you wouldn't have this arms race incentive anymore. Yeah.
Like right now, there's concern over drone people, different countries wanting to do autonomous drones and things like that, and how if you keep the person out of the loop or whatever it's called, that they'll start killing people arbitrarily or something like that.
The drones?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, there's all kinds of these problems of technology going awry, that kind of stuff, and what are people's incentives to develop these kinds of technologies, or how safe they're going to be, and all that kind of stuff. And basic income does not address these directly. So I think if we're comparing a world without basic income to a world with basic income.
I guess we just got here through fear.
What?
Fear.
We got here through fear. Yeah, that's where we get a lot of places. I think, there's certain motivations that drive some of this stuff that basic income might help with. If people aren't worried about scarcity or their own survival or their country's survival in the global economy, maybe we'll be a little more careful about some of this stuff. Yeah. Yeah. But basic income, it solves the problem of how to get money to consumers, and that's a problem that we've been incorrectly trying to solve using the labor market for hundreds of years. So it's not a new problem, and I don't think that the problem will just become obvious on its own. Like some people talk about, automation is going to come in, and then the need for basic income will be obvious, that kind of thing. I don't think that's ever going to happen, because we do have this capacity to keep making up jobs for people to do, and it can continue to not work efficiently, and people suffer needlessly and that kind of thing. So it's really basic income that once it's in place, it allows us to eliminate the jobs that we should have eliminated a long time ago.
Maybe there's a controversy surrounding where it comes from more than anything.
Mm-hmm.
How we're going to get it, how it's going to be distributed, you're just going to print money. I think that's what you're saying, but some people would argue that we have to address income inequality. So why don't we take from Jeff Bezos Bezos and Bill
Yeah.
Gates.
I mean, there's certainly people who argue that we take from Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, or that we should take money away from them, reduce the amount of wealth that they have. Someone today on Twitter said to me that it's important to compress the people at the top to I guess compress their wealth, or make it so that the difference between people is not so great. Compress the distance between people.
There's like a maximum wage and things like that.
Yeah. Now I think those things can kind of be debated, but they're not basic income. Basic income is just the giving of money to people, universally. That's all that basic income is. If you want to argue for a tax, or you want to argue for some sort of inequality measure to address that, then that's kind of a separate issue. You could combine these components and say, okay, here's a basic income, here's this other thing, and together they will achieve this effect. But the basic income on its own is just the giving money to people.
So that was a stretch.
That was a stretch.
But that is the first question that comes up.
Yeah.
I just want to back up. If you're talking about why people oppose it, I think your mom's point is on point, though, right?
Well, yeah, some people think that in order for the basic income to even be possible in the first place, it's got to have some tax associated with it. Now, obviously, I don't subscribe to that. I think the economy has a certain capacity for a certain amount of consumer spending, and then the question is, how do you get that money into consumers' hands? And there's no reason why the government can't just issue money and hand it to consumers.
They already do it with Social Security and other forms of benefits.
I mean,
they can.
I think the right way to think about government spending and taxation is that anytime the government spends money, they're issuing money into a certain part of the economy, and anytime the government taxes, they're destroying money in a certain part of the economy. So the question is, what are the constraints on the government issuing money into the economy through something like a basic income? And those constraints will be, well, what is the productive capacity of the economy? How much stuff can the economy produce in response to consumer spending? And taking money away from Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates isn't going to somehow create more room for consumers to spend more money. Either there's room or there isn't. And if there isn't room, then you're going to get inflation. I think a lot of people think that, well, if you're just printing money, then it's going to cause inflation. But if it was going to cause inflation, it's going to cause inflation regardless of whether you're taxing over here, because that money over there wasn't being spent into the productive economy anyway. So you're not loosening the constraint on the basic income by levying a tax somewhere else in the economy.
Well, let me ask you about the national debt then.
Yeah.
The national debt is huge.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any level of hugeness that would start to interrupt your plan? That just the interest payments would become so huge that it would become a problem? Or that the crowding out business, that the government would be competing for loans with business, and the government will always win, and so the interest rates would go up. And is there no level at which the debt would become a problem?
That's correct. There's no level at which the debt would become the problem. So the crowding out effect is real, and that's how we do monetary policy, right? The Fed actually gets to decide what the interest rates are in government debt, and if the interest rates are too high, they'll buy up excess. If the interest rates are too low, they'll sell some and then lower the price and therefore increase the yield. So what the government is doing there, or what the Fed is doing there, is they're saying, if you lend to the government, you'll get this interest rate, and therefore you're not going to lend to any private borrowers at a rate below that. And that's actually how they manage monetary policy, through this crowding out effect, right? And that's not a bad thing. That's how you keep prices stable, and it's how you prevent maybe unsound businesses from even getting into business in the first place. Like maybe you want to crowd out something that would otherwise be a malinvestment or something like that. So it's not a problem, and the national debt in terms of the total, the huge number that you see running up, that's just a record of how much money the government has spent into the economy in excess of taxation. And there's no reason why that number should be at any particular level. We should expect, if the government is spending more money than they're taxing year over year, we should expect as time moves forward, that number should increase. So 100 years from now, we should hope that if everything is working correctly in the economy, that the national debt should be much, much higher than it is right now.
It's a cumulative record.
Yeah, it's just a record. It's like a tally, right? It has nothing to do with the actual functioning of the economy. Like if our country were hundreds of years older, the national debt would be much higher than it is right now, assuming the economy worked the same way.
Right, and
back
the
then.
interest payments are large, but they can never really get out of control. They can never skyrocket.
Right. I mean,
You're actually paying interest to the government itself because the Treasury buys issues the bonds and then the Fed buys them up, or I believe.
Yeah, I mean that's right. There's a certain amount of interest that escapes that goes into the market that gets paid to private owners of Treasury securities, but the Fed decides how much that is, and they can set that level to whatever they want using monetary policy, and there's no limit to how much interest we can pay because the government can always spend money.
So the way
Right.
Alex likes to think about it is you don't want to default on the value of the currency itself. Right, then
Right.
you wouldn't be able to pay the interest because people wouldn't want the currency anymore. But that's different than the amount of interest.
Right.
It has more to do with the stability of what you can purchase.
You want to keep prices stable. You want to keep the currency's purchasing power stable so that people can rely on it as a standard unit of value.
It's like if I can purchase
yeah.
a stable amount with my dollar, then I'm going to be willing to accept dollars from the government for interest, right? But if I can't, that's a problem. But that would be the
Well,
inflation that Alex.
Well, no matter what happens, United States. I mean, if the United States Treasury securities are denominated in dollars, people are
pay them. Yeah.
people are gonna accept the interest in dollars no matter what. The question is, if you wreck the United States currency, if the dollar gets destroyed, then maybe we can't meaningfully borrow in dollars anymore. So we have to borrow in whatever currency is out there in the world, and then we face kind of some of these constraints of like actually defaulting and that kind of stuff. So we need to be mindful of keeping the currency strong and keeping it stable. We don't really do that through taxes. We do it through monetary policy, through interest rates. Yeah.
And if you had a basic income, you'd say we do it through setting the appropriate level so that it didn't outstrip the productive capacity. Or
Yeah,
at
I
least
mean,
it's stable.
I would say that, yeah, I mean, you want to get the level of consumer spending up to kind of what the economy can sustain without having inflation. So you want to match the flow of consumer spending to the productive capacity of the economy. But then in terms of managing inflation, you'd still have the Fed kind of managing in the short term, day to day, and you probably wouldn't want to cut people's basic income. Like that would kind of be upsetting to people.
Right, so managing the interest rates.
So you'd have the monetary policy kind of modulating things, and then the basic income, as the economy gets more productive capacity, you would expect it to gradually increase over time to kind of like get the most benefit. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is a topic that we disagree. Well, I have a different point of view. I said disagree.
Yeah.
A little bit different point of view.
Yeah.
And so the only thing a couple of ideas I'll just sort of throw in here. If you listen to Bloomberg, 7 a.m. Monday every morning during the work week when they do the Bloomberg surveillance, that's about the only time I listen to it because I just don't listen to the radio very much. And listen to how often you hear discussions that include the words, what happened to inflation? And it's asked not from the perspective of, great, it's asked from, you don't know.
What do you say?
What happened to inflation?
What do they mean there's none?
They don't understand why
They
inflation
don't
isn't
understand
happening.
why there is no inflation with a $20 trillion debt.
Oh, I see.
Right.
Okay.
And why we talk about fiscal policy. There's a robust discussion about what we don't seem to know. Like we don't understand why the policy is, you might say, effective, right? Because inflation is so low. But so I guess maybe where Alex and I sort of see some of this stuff a little bit differently. First, I'm a little bit older, so I remember the lines into the gas stations in the mid '70s. I remember the button win. Everybody remember what the button win
Whip
stood
inflation
for? Whip
now.
Inflation now. And it wasn't imagined, right? Inflation of that time period was not an imaginary thing. It was not an imaginary thing that it cost Gerald Ford election. Obviously, he was elected in the largest landslide in history by Richard Nixon the first time, but when he ran, the second time, he wasn't elected. And there was an element of the economy with respect to President Carter and Reagan's campaign. You know, there would be anyway. So yeah, I don't have an explanation any better than anybody else. If you read something like David Stockman, and I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but if you read his
Great
book,
Deformation.
Great Deformation, there is a school of thought, kind of a Stockman school of thought, that part of the Chinese mercantilist policy has gone a long way toward if you want to look at it as a palette of preventing inflation in the United States that otherwise would have occurred during our what should have been inflationary tax and spend policy, like we didn't tax enough to cover the spending. And there's some historical precedent for that, you know, as well. British mercantile policy, you know, vis-a-vis the world. You could say a little bit the United States too, and post-world and all that sort of thing. So, anyway, I guess I'm not as willing to accept that the Dick Cheney, who said something to the effect, "Remember, Reagan proved that deficits don't matter." Just to get a quote from a guy who probably a little bit the other side. You know, if we were talking about basic income, he probably wouldn't be at this meeting.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who are confused about why inflation isn't happening because it kind of goes against what they're seeing in the economy and kind of what their model is. So then they look for, you know, specific reasons. And I think it's true that, you know, China owning so much United States debt is, you know, part of what's keeping the price up and, you know, that kind of thing. But, you know, it fundamentally, I mean, it's always going to come down to consumer spending versus production, right? So inflation occurs when the spending outstrips the production. And there can be all kinds of different mechanisms going on that change that balance. So in terms of the national debt, in terms of the amount that's in existence, I don't think that's a very strong determiner of either consumer spending or production. It's just a record, right? So obviously you can have higher consumer spendings if you have higher deficits that fund a basic income. But if you have higher deficits where the government is spending money and, you know, tossing it down a hole, that's not going to cause inflation. That's not going to cause more consumer spending. So then, you know, the question is, what are the mechanisms that are getting money into the hands of consumers? If we were previously getting a lot of money to consumers through the labor market and now that mechanism is less so, then maybe that takes a bite out of inflation a little bit. If China is artificially kind of keeping their prices low in order to export goods to us, you know, that can take a bite out of prices too. But you know, in terms of assuming that higher national debt somehow leads to inflation, and then kind of coming up for reasons why it happens not to be happening, I don't know how useful that exploration is. But there are people who think about it that way, and there's, you know, most people feel like if the national debt is too high, that's a bad thing.
It's not as if inflation doesn't exist in other countries.
No.
I mean, what's the inflation rate in Turkey?
A lot.
A lot.
Yeah.
About Venezuela.
We talked about the whole thing.
Yeah. That was a good one. Yeah.
Should we wrap up?
Venezuela's national debt is actually quite low.
Yeah, it's hard to have a high debt when your money isn't worth anything. Yeah. But they actually do have a lot of foreign denominated debt that's kind of high as well. Yeah. So let's wrap up. Quick final thoughts. I guess we're kind of at the end. So does anyone have anything they want to say to kind of wrap up?
Man, I'm so glad we don't live in a world without a basic income. All those problems.
I know.
I know, right? Yeah. So I mean, I think, you know, it's really, you know, we can imagine, you know, removing something like Social Security, and we can imagine all of the difficult things that we have to do to compensate for the fact that we don't have that. But it's hard to imagine what are the things that we're doing because we don't have basic income. And, you know, like we can come up with some of them, but I think, you know, we're not going to know until we have a basic income, until we kind of have a full basic income that's calibrated to the productive capacity of the economy. And then we're going to look back, and there are going to be things that I can't even think of right now that are going to be like, how did we ever live like that? You know what I mean? So I think that's, yeah.
There's there's a story from Guy Standing. I've told this before about how when he was doing the pilot for basic income from 2011 to 2013, how he went to a village where initially where all the women wanted to go in a specific hut because they didn't want to have photographs taken by men, but when he returned at the end of the pilot, women were more vocal because they didn't have to listen to the elders, they didn't have to wear headscarves and things like that anymore.
Yeah.
So there's like more equality between different classes, like Brahmins and the pariahs or Dalits. That's it. That's what they're called now. They're more likely to cooperate now because they're not. When a poor person goes up and talks to someone, there's not an expectation that they're going to ask for money anymore. And things like that.
Right.
So there you go.
Yeah.
You know, we'll be looking back and thinking, why were people ever, worried about these things? How did we ever live in a world where people were so economically dependent on their families and, all this kind of stuff. So yeah. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Good
Alex.
discussion. 50th meeting. Oh, and hey, everyone on YouTube, we're moving the discussion group to Facebook. So you guys should check that out.